Hello everyone. The following story is based on Creepy Shift Roadside Diner, a game developed by Night Shift Team and published by Red Liam Studio. The free version is currently available on Steam, and the full version is set to release on October 28th. I played part of the demo last night, and it was quite enjoyable. I wouldn't recommend something I didn't believe in, so check it out if you're into eerie narratives. It's worth your time. I want to thank the developer and publisher for asking me to narrate this story for them. The links to the game and their YouTube channel can be found in this video's description. It was early autumn. A dense fog lazily spread over the marshes along Route 285 in New Mexico, occasionally revealing a strangely orange moon. Midnight was approaching as I lit a Marlboro Red and stared at the roadside diner where I was to spend the night. My tasks included washing dishes and completing minor inventory work, whatever that meant. Despite my disdain for the situation, I had no reason to complain. The pay was exceptional. In one night, I could earn enough to cover 2 installments of the loan that had been suffocating me since the unexpected news of fatherhood. The diner itself was nothing extraordinary, a small shack clad in metal siding, adorned with tacky decor and reeking of burnt grease. These kinds of places were commonplace in the area, all blending into a similar aesthetic. The interior was equally uninspiring: checkered tile floors, a jukebox, a long counter, and fake leather booths. It was the quintessential haven for truckers and teenagers avoiding their mothers, who'd rather preserve their freshly painted nails than cook. However, one detail stood out in the kitchen: a peculiar painting of a pastor holding a sickle, with candles burning beneath it. The pastor's face bore a grim expression, sending a chill through me. It reminded me of an old man from the bus ride to the diner. The man had smelled faintly unwashed but wasn't outright homeless. When he found out I'd be spending the night at this diner, he turned pale, speaking of a blood moon, a curse, and great danger. Before parting, he handed me a sheet of paper with strict rules to follow. I dismissed him as a kook. As I now stared at the painting, I muttered, "The family resemblance is uncanny," my voice echoing through the empty diner. But the more I thought about the pastor and the old man, the less it fazed me. I'd been on Earth for 20 years and had seen plenty of religious oddities. Brushing it off, I started my work. The night progressed slowly. Well past midnight, I was mopping the floor when the jukebox suddenly came to life, blasting country music. A chill swept through the diner. Annoyed, I went to turn it off, as I wasn't a fan of country music. Just as I silenced the hillbilly tunes, I heard a strange noise coming from the basement. It didn't sound mechanical, it was more like a wild animal trying to escape. I had no intention of investigating. It wasn't part of my job description, so I popped in my headphones and tried to drown out the unnerving sound. But the eerie atmosphere persisted. A cold breath brushed the back of my neck, as if someone were standing right behind me. Spinning around quickly, I found no one. My nerves frayed, I sat down at the bar to collect myself. The memory of the old man's rules from the bus crept into my mind. I still had the piece of paper he'd given me in my pocket. With trembling hands, I pulled it out and read. 1. All lights must stay on all night. 2. The jukebox must not play. 3. Draw lines of salt at all doors and windows. 4. Keep holy water with you at all times. 5. Make sure the candles under Pastor William's painting never go out. 6. They will try to deceive you. Trust no one. Speak to no one. 7. At 3:33, hide in the broom closet and don't come out for 5 minutes. 8. Do not leave before dawn. I read the rules aloud, trying to laugh them off as ridiculous, but deep down, I didn't find them amusing at all. Returning to my tasks, I entered the break room to mop the floor and stumbled upon something unsettling. A glass bottle of what looked like holy water sat on a desk, with a piece of paper taped to the wall above it. The paper bore a prayer. May this water, in service of your mysteries, effectively drive away evil spirits and ward off the enemy's possession. Should anything threaten our lives, may it flee in panic when sprinkled with this water. Next to it, I noticed a printed prayer to Pastor William, though I didn't have a chance to read it. A honk from outside startled me. The van delivering supplies had arrived. With a sigh, I lit another cigarette, grabbed the keys, and stepped outside. The night was eerily silent except for the rustling of courier tape fluttering in the wind. After unlocking the basement door, I went back for a flashlight. The dimly lit basement felt oppressive, and the smell of damp mold hung heavily in the air. Carrying the heavy boxes down the narrow stairs was a grueling task. On one trip, I accidentally bumped the light switch with my shoulder, plunging the basement into darkness. The bulb flickered weakly before shattering. Panic gripped me. My hands shook as I fumbled for the flashlight. When I finally managed to switch it on, the beam illuminated something horrifying: a twisted figure draped in rags, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. It moved toward me. I froze, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body was paralyzed. A raspy, inhuman voice hissed from the creature. Snapping out of my daze, I turned and bolted, tripping over a box in my haste. Certain the thing would grab my leg, I braced myself, but instead, I heard the clinking of chains and an enraged scream behind me. Without looking back, I raced up the stairs, locking the door behind me. My legs felt like jelly, my heart pounding as though it would burst. Desperation set in. I searched the diner for salt, pouring thick lines along all doors and windows. I made sure every light was on and lit fresh candles beneath Pastor William's painting. Sitting at the bar, I buried my face in my arms, my mind reeling. Am I losing it? I whispered to myself. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head: exhaustion, stress, and lack of sleep playing cruel tricks on me. For weeks I'd been getting by on just a few hours of rest each night, and the weight of unplanned fatherhood hadn't helped. Still, I couldn't ignore what I'd seen. After downing a few gulps of booze I'd stashed in my pocket, I forced myself to return to work. Cleaning the kitchen floor seemed like a safe distraction, but when I accidentally rubbed my eye with a hand that had been in the cleaning solution, pain flared up instantly. Why do I always mess something up? I cursed, the silence of the diner amplifying my voice. Blinded temporarily by the stinging chemical, I heard the jukebox start playing that damned country music again. Furious, I stormed out to shut it off. As I reached the jukebox, a chill ran down my spine, the same sensation as before, as if someone were right behind me. I spun around, holy water bottle in hand, but no one was there. Then I saw a figure staring at me through the window. In my panic, I leaned against the jukebox and accidentally turned the music off. When I looked back, the figure was gone. Shaken, I decided to rinse my eye. The momentary reprieve gave me time to think this place wasn't safe. I didn't know how much of the danger was real, or if I was simply descending into madness, but I wasn't about to take any chances. As I unpacked boxes in the break room, I remembered the prayer to Pastor William. I decided to read it more closely, hoping to find some answers. To my shock, it wasn't a prayer, it was an exorcism. Expel demons and spirits of non-believers with your powers. Subdue the beasts. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I sat down, lit a cigarette, and took a swig of vodka. If I survive this shift, I muttered, I'm never coming back here. When I finished counting the inventory, a horn honked outside. I froze, remembering that only one delivery was scheduled for the night. My chest tightened. Against my better judgment, I peeked out the window. There was no truck, no pallet, just the empty lot bathed in moonlight. The old man's rules rang in my head. They will try to deceive you. Trust no one. Speak to no one. For the first time, I regretted dismissing him as a lunatic. The clock above the door read 3:15. I was far from dawn, and my nerves were fraying. I busied myself with tasks relighting the candles, loading dishes into the washer, and disposing of old fryer grease. Anything to distract myself. As 3:30 approached, I prepared for the next rule: hide in the broom closet at 3:33 and don't come out for 5 minutes. I poured fresh lines of salt around the broom closet door, grabbed a long kitchen knife, and locked myself inside. The moment the clock struck 3:33, an icy chill washed over me. My body shook uncontrollably as I heard shuffling from the basement. The sounds grew louder, more frantic, as if something or someone was in a frenzy to escape. My fear peaked when I heard footsteps in the diner. They were slow and deliberate, heading straight for the broom closet. The handle didn't turn, but the figure stood just outside, its long, steady breaths audible through the door. Time crawled. I clutched the knife tightly, though it felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Then, as abruptly as it had come, the presence retreated and the basement shuffling quieted. I stayed hidden, trembling, until I was certain it was safe to emerge. I finally mustered the courage to leave the broom closet. The diner was eerily quiet, yet the oppressive atmosphere lingered. My eyes were drawn to the bar counter, where a deep gash nearly 2 meters long scarred the surface. For a fleeting moment, I worried about being held accountable for the damage. Then I realized how absurd that thought was in the face of everything else happening. I drained the remaining vodka from my flask and lit a Marlboro, inhaling deeply. The rising smoke seemed to calm my frayed nerves. Don't worry about it, I told myself. What matters is getting through this night alive. A sudden, uncontrollable burst of laughter escaped me, but it quickly turned into sobs. Strangely, the emotional release steadied me. I wiped my face, checked the salt lines, and ensured every light was on. The candles under Pastor William's painting were burning brightly, though his image seemed slightly different now, almost as if he were smirking. Dismissing the thought, I decided to occupy myself with mopping the floor. The repetitive task distracted me from the creeping dread. Occasionally I glanced out the window, but the fog remained dense, shrouding the world outside. It felt as though I were utterly alone, cut off from reality. An hour passed. While placing chairs on the freshly cleaned floor, I heard a loud crash from the dumpster behind the diner. Slowly, I approached the window but saw nothing. Then I noticed the window pane trembling in its frame. Straining to listen, I thought I heard voices faint, distant, like a group of people moving closer. My heart raced as I spotted glowing pillars of fire in the distance, growing larger and brighter. Fear gripped me. Before I could react, frantic knocking came from the front door, accompanied by a child's voice. Help, he's going to kill me. Please let me in. Without thinking, I rushed to the door. But when I opened it, there was no one there. Only a bone-chilling cold greeted me. In that instant, I realized my mistake. An unimaginable force grabbed my throat, lifting me off the ground. Sharp nails dug into my skin as I was dragged into the gravel lot. I couldn't move, my body paralyzed. As the grip around my neck tightened, I closed my eyes, resigned to my fate. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the grip loosened. Gasping for air, I opened my eyes to see a ghostly woman before me. Her pale face was scarred, her black hair flowing as if caught in an invisible wind. Her blue lips whispered unintelligible words, her gaze filled with anguish and fury. Desperation fueled me. I felt the shattered remains of the holy water bottle in my pocket, the sacred liquid soaking my leg. My hand found a shard of glass, and with a cry, I plunged it into her arm. The ghost let out an ear-piercing scream before vanishing into the night. I collapsed onto the ground, bleeding and gasping for breath. Somehow I managed to drag myself back inside, locking the door behind me. I awoke on the blood-stained checkered floor, battered and broken. It was difficult to move, but I knew I wasn't safe. My vision blurred, and I slipped into a state between life and death. In this dreamlike trance, I found myself in a small wooden church. Pastor William stood at the pulpit, delivering a sermon filled with venomous hatred for savages. The scene shifted. Smoke filled the air, and I witnessed atrocities committed by settlers against Native Americans. I saw a woman and child imprisoned in a barn, their captors lit by the crimson glow of the blood moon. The woman, a white settler, tried to free them, but her child followed, unnoticed, and cried out. The noise alerted others, and the woman and her child were captured. The next vision revealed the woman's identity, Pastor William's wife. In a fit of rage, William struck her, and when she defied him, murdered her and their child. I jolted awake, back in the diner, pain searing through my body. Sirens wailed in the distance as police arrived. When they questioned me, I foolishly told them the truth. The result: a month-long stay in a psychiatric hospital under constant observation and medication. When I was released, I returned to my family, my girlfriend, and my son, and tried to build a peaceful life. I found a stable job, but peace eluded me. Sleepless nights were spent researching the diner, its history, and the visions I'd experienced. I discovered that my visions matched the tragic history of Mary Smith and her child, victims of Pastor William's cruelty. Now, years later, I've made a decision. Tonight I return to the roadside diner, not to work, but to end the curse. I'll find Mary's remains and her child's, and I'll burn them to ash. Only then can I free her from the centuries-long tyranny of that monstrous pastor. Three years ago, I contracted bacterial meningitis. I live in South Florida. I don't believe there was an outbreak going on or anything, so I'm not sure how I caught it or who I could have caught it from. I started developing really bad symptoms, painful headaches, confusion, sleepiness, nausea, and lack of appetite. But when the hallucinations started, I knew I had something really serious. While laying sick in bed while my husband was at work, I heard a child's voice call Mom from downstairs. We don't have any kids. I dragged myself out of bed to look down the stairway and called my husband's name. Of course, he didn't answer because he was at work. The headache I got from standing was too much, so I went back to bed. For a second time, I heard a voice call from downstairs. It said, "Hello." I picked up the phone and called my husband, freaking out and telling him that I was hearing a scary child's voice from inside the house and thought I was hallucinating. He heard how distressed I was and left work early to bring me to the hospital. While waiting for him to get home, I changed out of my pajamas. While doing so, I had to run to the bathroom to throw up. As I was mid-throwing up, I heard another voice from outside of the bathroom. I couldn't hear what it said, nor could I tell if it sounded the same as the other voice I had heard. I felt like I was losing my mind. I wasn't diagnosed until I arrived at the hospital, and apparently, if untreated, what I had could be very serious, even fatal. The doctor told me that hallucinations were unusual, but not unheard of in cases like mine. I was given antibiotics through a needle shortly after arriving at the hospital with my husband. The doctor told me I was fortunate to have come so quickly because if I had waited much longer, the illness could have had lasting effects or possibly been fatal. My husband stayed with me for a few hours in the room. I was told I would have to stay in the hospital for a few days to a week, given the severity of my symptoms. Around 10 o'clock, my husband left to go home since he had work the next day. The nurse told me to call her if I had any issues. Though I still felt like absolute death, I nodded off pretty quickly. That's when I started having this strange dream where my ex-husband was in the room, standing over my bed, looking down at me and talking. He was saying horrible things about my current husband. He patted my head and said he was glad I was okay and that he came as soon as he saw my husband leave. Then he went into a rant about how he despised my current husband and wanted to kill him. He kept rubbing my forehead and then left the room. I often have bad dreams about my ex-husband because of how toxic and abusive our marriage was, which is why it ended. I'd rather not go into details about that. I woke up in this drowsy, lightheaded state and looked around the room. There was a chair pulled up in front of my hospital bed, but no one was sitting in it. The chair hadn't been there when my husband left. It was still the middle of the night, so I went back to sleep. The next morning, the nurse came into the room. I told her about the weirdly vivid dream I had, and she frowned. She told me that wasn't a dream. Your cousin David came to visit you last night. I told her, I don't have any cousins that live in the state. She looked more serious now and said, well, someone who said they were your cousin David visited you late last night. David was the name of my ex-husband. After explaining this, the nurse got a doctor. The doctor told me that the antibiotics may have caused delirium, which hindered my ability to recognize sleep from wakefulness. This, he said, explained why I so vividly heard what David was saying. I called my husband to tell him what had happened, and of course he was livid and concerned. He came back to visit me again that night after work. That day, I texted David, asking him what the hell he was thinking by visiting me, and how he knew I was in the hospital. My text delivered, but he ignored it. I sent a follow-up telling him I heard all of his threats toward my husband, and that I would get the police involved. Minutes later, he responded saying, I never made any threats toward your husband. I was simply there when I heard what happened to make sure you were okay. You must have heard things in your sleep. I responded, stay out of my life or I'll get the police involved again. He didn't respond after that. I never told my husband about the threats I heard in my half-asleep state because I didn't know if they were real or not. With a mix of the antibiotics and my already weird audible hallucinations the day before, I didn't think it was impossible that what I heard wasn't actually what was said, but I could be wrong. I left the hospital the next week. This happened in 2012. I was working as a construction worker, and we were remodeling this old hospital that had been closed down for quite some time. The place was built in the 1950s, and from what we were told, it had been shut down in the early 2000s due to a combination of funding issues and outdated facilities. Our task was to repurpose the building into a new medical office. The job was fairly standard, but things started to feel eerie as soon as we entered the hospital for the first time. The place was in shambles. It felt like people had just up and left in a hurry. There were old beds still lined up in rooms, medical equipment scattered about, and even patient files left on desks. The air was thick with dust, and everything smelled of mildew and decay. The first couple of weeks went by smoothly enough, with the crew tearing down walls, removing old fixtures, and prepping the place for renovation. But then, strange things started happening. One night, I was asked to stay late and supervise the unloading of some new equipment. It was already past 7 p.m., and everyone else had gone home for the day. I was alone in this huge, dark hospital with nothing but a flashlight and a portable radio for company. The power had been shut off for the renovation, so I had to rely on a small generator to keep some of the work lights on. As I was walking down one of the long corridors, I started hearing what sounded like footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it might have been an echo of my own steps, but when I stopped, the footsteps continued for a few seconds before stopping as well. I turned around, shining my flashlight down the hallway, but there was nothing there, just darkness. I shrugged it off and continued with my inspection, but the feeling of being watched never left me. A few minutes later, I was in one of the old patient rooms checking to make sure the floors were safe. That's when I heard a faint voice. It was so quiet at first that I thought I had imagined it. But then, I heard it again, clearer this time. It was a woman's voice, whispering my name. I froze, my heart racing. I looked around the room, shining my flashlight in every corner, but there was no one there. The voice came again, louder this time, as if it was right next to me. Help me. I bolted out of that room, not caring what I left behind. I ran down the hallway, past the rooms we hadn't touched yet, and made my way back to the front entrance. The footsteps followed me the entire way, but I never once looked back. By the time I reached the entrance, I was panting and sweating, even though it was the middle of winter. I quickly locked up and waited outside until the delivery truck showed up with the equipment. I didn't tell the driver what had happened. I didn't want to seem crazy. The next day, I told one of the other workers about what had happened. He gave me a strange look and then said, "You're not the first one to experience something like that." Apparently, several of the other workers had heard voices and seen strange shadows moving around the building, especially in the area where the old morgue was located. Some even claimed they had seen figures in hospital gowns wandering the halls late at night. The final straw for me came about a week later. I was working late again, but this time I wasn't alone. Another guy from the crew was there, and we were both finishing up some work in one of the patient rooms. We were packing up for the night when we heard a loud crash coming from down the hallway. It sounded like something heavy had fallen over. We both grabbed our flashlights and went to check it out, thinking that maybe some of the equipment had toppled over. When we got to the source of the noise, we found that an entire metal shelf had been knocked over. The weird thing was, the shelf had been bolted to the wall just a few days earlier, and it would have taken a lot of force to knock it down. There was no sign of anyone else in the building, and all of the doors were still locked from the inside. We quickly cleaned up the mess and got out of there as fast as we could. After that, I refused to work alone in that hospital. I told my boss that if he needed someone to supervise after hours, he could find someone else. Thankfully, the job was finished a few weeks later, and I haven't set foot in that place since. I still wonder about what I heard and saw that night. Was it just my imagination, or was there something more sinister lurking in that old hospital? Back in 2007, I worked part-time as an aide for a hospital in downtown Chicago. I was 19 years old and assisted patients with proper care, including food, water, and general checkups. Sometimes I had to deal with weird and angry patients who felt entitled to special treatment. This was more common among older patients, and while it annoyed me, I tried to understand their situation. Most days I'd be running back and forth with food and drinks, only getting an hour's break. One day, my manager informed me of a new patient who had just been admitted. She was an older woman, probably in her mid-70s, and obsessed with her daughter, Sarah. She talked about Sarah every day, claiming how sweet she was. Unfortunately, Sarah had passed away years earlier, and the woman never moved past her grief. We sympathized with her and listened for support. Eventually, she was transferred to the ICU as her condition worsened, and after a few weeks, she passed away. My colleagues and I were saddened by her death and grieved for about a week before getting back into our regular work routine. A month later, while sweeping the floors, I saw what appeared to be a small child down the hall. She wore a pink skirt and a white shirt. I was confused because there were no children on the floor, and it was well past visiting hours. The girl just stood there, staring at me. When I approached her, she ran into a nearby room. I couldn't let a child wander into a patient's room, so I followed her. Upon entering, I found the room empty, with just a hospital bed and a TV. I called out for the girl but got no response. Feeling creeped out, I checked the bathroom and even under the bed but found no one. I reported the incident, informing my colleagues of a loose child on the floor, and asked them to keep an eye out. But despite several people looking, no one could find her. The creepiest part was when I checked the security footage. It showed me trying to grab the girl's attention, but the girl wasn't visible in the footage at all. I freaked out and informed my supervisor, but he brushed it off as a joke. No matter how many times I denied it, he refused to believe me. To this day, I am convinced that the girl I saw was the woman's daughter, Sarah. I'd like to think she appeared as a thank you message for taking care of her mother. One colleague believed me because he had also seen the girl a few weeks before. He told me that, while in the basement collecting medical supplies, he saw a girl in a pink skirt running around, which scared him. He didn't report it, thinking people would call him crazy. Since then, I haven't seen Sarah, but I've noticed minor things go missing in patients' rooms: pillows, candy wrappers, and even water bottles. It could have been another aide, but I've always wondered if it was her. I've been working at a general hospital for about 6 years now. For privacy reasons, I won't disclose the hospital's name, but this took place in a not-so-great area of Philadelphia. Those who live in or have been around Philly will probably know what I'm talking about: drugs, high crime, and the constant sound of sirens several times a week. The hospital even had to hire police due to the gun violence that occurred around the area. I'm 35, and while my job is rewarding, it can be very stressful, often leaving me drained. I work security at the hospital, and my job takes me to the psych ward, morgue, and ER. My shifts are constantly all over the place, but the pay is good enough to keep a roof over my head. Given the hospital's location, our security contract often gets abused, making us do tasks we probably shouldn't be doing. One night I received a call from the ICU about a patient who had recently passed away. I was responsible for bagging the body. The deceased was an older man, likely in his mid-60s. I didn't ask how he died, as that wasn't my concern. I put on my gloves, prepared the body, and placed him in the body bag. Just before zipping it up, I paused, staring at him. For some reason I felt odd and uncomfortable. I had dealt with many bodies before, but this one made me feel deeply disturbed. After bagging the body, I dragged him down to the morgue. following procedure as instructed, and placed him in the freezer to await the funeral home. Hospital protocol requires us to stay in the morgue with the body until it's picked up. It's a rule I find unnecessary, but I follow it. When the funeral home arrived, I led them to the freezer, where we transferred the body into their possession. It sounds simple, but it takes careful handling to ensure safety. As I pulled the body from the freezer, things immediately took a strange turn. The funeral home staff claimed I had the wrong body. I was confused. There were only 2 bodies in the freezer, the one I had just pulled and a 16-year-old who had been hit by a train. There was no way I could have mixed them up. After some back and forth, the funeral home staff realized I did have the correct body. One of them looked at the tag, which clearly identified the man. But then, as they unzipped the body bag, they recoiled. The man I had placed in the morgue was now contorted. His right arm was behind his back, he lay on his right side, and his left arm was stretched in front of him. His mouth hung open unnaturally, and his eyes bulged. My mind raced. How could this be? I had laid him in the bag with his arms at his sides. No one else had access to the freezer except me, as I was the only officer on duty with the key. There was no chance anyone else could have touched him, and I would never be so disrespectful or unprofessional as to tamper with a body like that. The funeral director began accusing me, asking how I could have left the body in such a state. I stood there silently as they zipped up the bag and left. I was written up by my head director for allegedly tampering with the body, even though I explained that I hadn't done anything. He didn't want to hear it. To this day, I am still haunted by the incident. It's simply impossible to know what actually happened, and I haven't been able to get over it. I've been an RN at General Hospital for about 3 years now. It's one of the toughest yet most rewarding jobs I've had, as I help people in serious conditions. Most of the time, you'd be caring for patients and administering their medication. We've had several people come in on late nights complaining about fibromyalgia and other common conditions that could easily be treated at home. I'd often deal with these patients by giving them simple over-the-counter medication, assuming they had insurance. However, there were times when I had to treat patients who were in actual need. Treating these patients not only made me feel rewarded, but you also sometimes developed a bond with them. This story follows that same principle. One time, I cared for an elderly woman whose husband had just died and she had been admitted to the hospital for a severe bacterial infection. Her name was Kate, and she was the sweetest lady you could ever meet. She would always tell us stories about the animals she used to own. She loved animals and used them as a coping mechanism. Unfortunately, the hospital didn't allow any pets other than service animals, which made her profoundly sad. I felt terrible for her, as she remained kind to us despite everything she was going through. Over the past week or so, I developed an emotional connection with her. I made sure to show her extra attention because I truly cared for her. It was heartwarming, but as a nurse, it's my responsibility to be there for my patients. One day, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and thanked me for all I had done for her. Her words shocked me and left me in disbelief because I realized what she meant. She passed away the next day, and I cried for nearly a week. The other nurses were sad, but not as much as I was since I had been one of the people she truly cared for. Weeks went by, and I eventually moved on from her passing. She would occasionally pop into my mind, but being a nurse is a busy job, and I had to keep moving forward. One night I was speaking with a colleague at the front desk about a patient's chart when she asked me to get a piece of equipment from the basement. The basement is where we usually keep our equipment and other medical supplies. It's not common in most hospitals, but we had one here. It's rare for any of us to go down to the basement, so I knew we needed something important. I took the elevator down and turned on the lights. As soon as I stepped out, I got an eerie feeling. I had been in the basement many times before, but I had never felt like this. It felt like a sense of dread coming from somewhere, but I couldn't pinpoint where. To be fair, hospital basements are creepy, so I brushed off the feeling and continued down the hallway. I grabbed the equipment from one of the shelves when I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind me. They didn't sound like someone wearing shoes, but rather barefoot. I figured it was one of my co-workers trying to scare me. Instead of getting mad, I decided to catch them in the act. I walked out of the room and back into the main area, but I didn't see anyone. At some point I called out, "Hello? Anyone else in here?" as expected. I got no response, which only made me want to leave faster. I questioned whether the sounds were coming from the electrical panels. I hurried towards the elevator, and just as I was halfway there, I heard it clear as day, the voice of an old woman shouting my name from down the hall. Sarah, it only took me a second to realize that it sounded exactly like Kate. I was officially creeped out and hurried back to my station. I didn't tell anyone about it, thinking they'd call me crazy. The only person I confided in was a nurse I trusted dearly. Based on my expression while telling her, I think she believed me because she seemed to understand. Needless to say, that was my last time going down to the basement. Now, whenever someone asks me to go down there, I always find a way to get someone else to do it. Every time someone else goes down there, I get looks, but quite frankly, I don't care. I've never believed in the paranormal, but I have no explanation for what happened that night. I was barely old enough to understand how close to death I was because of the disease I had. Let alone, did I have a clue about what was about to happen to me during treatment. My mother took me to the hospital and told the doctors to do whatever they needed to save my life. They required a spinal tap before continuing treatment. The look on my mother's face when they said that told me everything I needed to know, despite the fact that I had no idea what a spinal tap was. I remember my mother pleading with the doctors to find some way to make the procedure less traumatic for me, but for some reason they couldn't put me under general anesthesia. Instead, they offered a new experimental treatment on humans, at the time intravenous ketamine. My mother had never heard of the drug before, and my father wasn't there. They explained that it was traditionally used as a horse tranquilizer, but had recently been approved for use in humans, even in pediatric care. Ever since, my mom swears up and down that's all they told her about it. Maybe it was a time-sensitive case, or maybe the doctors thought if they told her everything that was involved with being under the influence of the drug, she would refuse to let me have it, which in their minds would make the spinal tap harder to go through. Frankly, it boggles my mind that doctors would even consider giving ketamine to a child, but that's what happened. They wheeled me into the operating room and told me what was going to happen, that I would have to lay on my side, and they would insert a needle into my back. They said it would feel extremely uncomfortable. I know that's what they said now, but at the time I was so disoriented, scared, and confused that it all sounded like gibberish, like how adults sound in Charlie Brown when they just go wah wah wah, if you know what I mean. All the doctors and nurses were wearing masks and gowns too, which made them look almost inhuman. I had to get naked and put on a hospital gown, adding to the stress of it all because I had to be exposed to a bunch of strangers. The only thing that kept me sane was that my mother was allowed to be there with me so I could hold her hand. However, before they did the tap, they inserted the IV needle into my arm to deliver the ketamine. I cried and screamed. I remember squirming just from having that needle put in me, and I didn't even understand how much bigger the next one would be. Then they turned me over to my side, and I held my mother's hand, squeezing harder than before, looking into her eyes, crying and trying to be brave and sit still. At first, all I could feel on my back was the cold hospital air. But then something happened, everything started to feel weird. Of course, I know now that this was the ketamine beginning to take effect, but I didn't understand this at the time. An all-encompassing dread washed over my body, and I also felt like I was losing control of it, like my soul was slipping away second by second. Then, it literally felt like I was dying and rising up to heaven. I was lifted up from the table and could see my own body and everyone around me. What I saw filled me with a mixture of terror and hatred. The doctor was lining the needle up against my back, and for the first time I saw how massive the thing was. There was my mother watching it all happen, letting them do it. Suddenly I knew I couldn't go through with it anymore. I screamed, kicked, and punched at everything around me, hell-bent on getting off that table and running away. The nurses tried to hold me down, but they were struggling to keep me contained. Somebody called for more help, and that's when two gigantic, muscular nurses rushed in, grabbed hold of me, and pinned me down to the table, along with 4 or 5 other people. My mother was crying in the corner now. Apparently I had hit her in the face, but I could still see everything that was going on around me, and the IV drip was still feeding me ketamine straight to my blood, which went directly to my brain. Now all the masked and gowned doctors and nurses didn't look human at all. They looked like monsters, demons even. Sick, twisted, demented creatures that my mom had sold my soul to. And now they were forcibly extracting my soul from my body with that horrible needle. I looked at my mother with bitter contempt and screamed that I hated her for letting this happen to me. It only made her cry harder. No matter how hard I fought back, once they all got a hold of me, I couldn't even squirm. They held me down and finished the spinal tap. When the needle went into my back, it felt like I was being torn apart from the inside. And because I was moving so much, waves of pain shot through my body. Finally, I accepted that I just had to sit still, but it was awful. I could feel my essence being drained, something I would never get back. Thankfully, after a few seconds, it was over, but I wasn't the same. I didn't move for hours after that, and I wouldn't talk to my mother or even look at her. Being drugged and having a needle shoved into my spinal cord as a child is easily the most traumatic thing I've ever experienced in my life. And the stupid thing I hate the most about it is the fact that it was all just to confirm what the doctors basically already knew, that I had spinal meningitis. When I was a teenager, there was an old abandoned hospital that had been built in the 1800s. It had long since been replaced and left to rot. The building couldn't be torn down as it was a historical site, but it also couldn't be repurposed. Ever since it was condemned, nobody took it upon themselves to be the caretaker of the place. Security was basically non-existent, so it became a rite of passage in my neighborhood to hop the fence on Halloween and explore the ruins. Finally, the time came when my friends and I got the bug, and we knew we were going to be the next to do it. We didn't even bother to wear costumes. Nobody wanted to go trick-or-treating or go to a party. The coolest party in town was me and my friends on the roof of the old hospital. All we needed to do was figure out a way up and avoid the numerous hazards along the way, the rumors of which were boasted about to a great extent by all the people who had already gone through it. From broken glass, rusty nails, and squatters, to trapdoors, collapsing ceilings, and even ghosts supposedly. Understandably, we were all a bit nervous but excited too. It was the coolest thing any of us had ever done. It seemed like there was even an entire path laid out for us by the people who had done it before. The door at the front entrance was already broken open, so we just stepped right inside, undeterred. Immediately on the first story was a triage center. It was too dark, even with our flashlights, to see very far down the hallway. A staircase was right there. Not too much was happening on that level, so we opted not to bother exploring the bottom and moved on to the second of 3 stories. The ceiling had collapsed in on itself at the landing of the second story, so we went out from there to look for another stairwell. The second story was somehow even darker. The floor beneath our feet was soft and felt like it could cave in at any moment, so we spread out to distribute our weight. We thought we were being smart, staying quiet, but pointing out all the things we noticed, like piles of old medical waste, strange stacks of beds blocking off certain doorways, which we dared not even think of entering. Signs indicated what different rooms had been, giving us a picture of how the place might have looked in its prime. It certainly was far from that by the time we arrived. Mold grew up the walls, vines snaked through the ceiling tiles, and water dripped from the 3rd floor. Every single sound we made echoed in such a way that it sounded like a stranger was whispering around every corner. We kept saying how cool everything was, but deep down I think we were all scared. The last thing any of us wanted was for a crazy hobo to jump out at us for invading his home, or for one of the many ghost stories about the supposedly haunted hospital to somehow turn out to be true. Even decades after it had closed, and even to naive and careless boys like us, we could literally feel the lingering presence of suffering and damned souls that had perished in the place we were trespassing. However, the only things that lived there seemed to be rats and flies, not nearly as many as we were expecting. After a few more minutes of checking things out, we finally reached the other side of the building and found another stairwell. This one went all the way up to the roof. Once we stepped in the damp concrete tube, we could hear and feel the outside air blowing in through an open door or hatch, whichever one it was. We were dying to know. We picked up our pace as we went up the stairs, excited to see the view. We barely noticed the moss that was growing on the steps, which slickened the grip we had under our shoes. Finally, at the very top of the stairwell, there it was, the open door. At the landing before it, we all paused to take a mental image of the sight. As luck would have it, the moon was shining right through it. If any of us had brought a camera, it would have made a legendary photo. At last, it was only a moment of appreciation before we all wanted to finish our journey. Out of the 4 of us, I was the last in line at the stairs. A friend of mine was leading the pack as we all went up in single file. We were just seconds away. But then, the last thing we could have expected happened. Out of nowhere, a flurry of bats exploded from a nest that we hadn't seen. My friend at the top got startled, slipped on the moss, and fell back, causing a chain reaction that led us to all fall like dominoes. 3 of my friends landed on top of me, and my head crashed right onto the concrete. That's the last thing I remember before waking up in a real hospital. I had cracked my head right open. I fractured my skull, and my friends had to carry me all the way out of that abandoned wreck and get help for me. They had to tell me 100 times before I could finally accept that's what had happened. Sadly, it seemed that none of us managed to get to the roof of the abandoned hospital like we had hoped that night, but I'm glad I had good enough friends to help me out when I needed it. To this day, a lot of people don't believe me when I say that's exactly what happened and why I fell. They say bats don't stay in their nests at night, but I guess even nocturnal flying mammals like to sleep in sometimes. I'm not an expert, it's just what I saw. I was a nurse for over 40 years. I spent the majority of my career in hospitals, working in the ER in my earlier days and later transferring to the ICU. I've seen a lot of horrible things happen to people and built up a strong stomach for all sorts of things. There are 1,000 stories I could tell, but one above all is the worst thing I ever witnessed. It happened in my first year of working in the ICU, and I still don't have an explanation for it. Before he fell under my care, a man showed up in the ER with strange symptoms: delirium, vomiting, and what appeared to be first-degree burns all over his body. At first, they thought it was caused by a chemical, which led them to believe they needed to cleanse his skin and purge his system. However, when they tried to wash his skin, it just came off. What had looked like first-degree burns was actually just the tip of the iceberg, an iceberg of total tissue disintegration. At this point, the ER team had no idea what they were dealing with. This was decades ago, long before the internet. The man refused to answer any questions about what happened to him, and he had no forms of identification in his possession. It was as if he had just been dumped there. Eventually, the doctors figured out that the man was suffering from acute radiation sickness, but the dose he received and the severity of his case was still unknown. All we knew was that it was bad and he probably wouldn't survive. He was transferred to the ICU, and that's when I met him. I knew it wouldn't be long before it would be impossible to get any information out of him, even if he wanted to tell us anything. So every time I did anything for him, whether it was changing his IV or getting his vitals, I berated him with questions. I asked for his name, if he had any family, how he had been dosed with radiation, and if he had any idea how much he had received. But he didn't answer many of my questions. The only thing he really ever said to me, and apparently the only thing he ever said to anyone, was, "I wish they would have just shot me." It was like the words slipped out of him, despite his best effort to keep them in. He immediately looked like he regretted saying anything. I kept asking who they were, but after that single sentence, his lips were sealed. Days passed, and his condition worsened. His skin started to turn a rainbow of colors as it gradually withered away and liquefied, oozing through all the bandages we put on him and separating from his body at the slightest touch. I thought he would scream from the pain more, but most of his nerve endings had already turned to mush. The damage was all over his body, but it was concentrated in his hands and feet, crawling up his arms and legs, leaving his vital organs for last. It was almost like it was intentionally and cruelly ensuring he was alive and aware as his body slowly decayed. We would have never found out who he was or how he got radiation poisoning if his family hadn't randomly shown up on the third day. They had been traveling to every hospital in the area, asking about a man who had disappeared 3 days prior. They described the man in great detail, and it was clear that the man they were looking for was the one slowly deteriorating in the ICU. These days, we might have had to deny them access to see him because of HIPAA regulations, but things were different back then. Everybody in the hospital wanted that poor man to have some good before he died. So we allowed his family upstairs to see him, but they couldn't stand to look at him without breaking down into hysterical tears. After the reunion, we asked the family for more information, and that's when we finally got some. The man worked for the government as a nuclear waste management worker. He was one of the guys who buried barrels of radioactive leftovers and had been compiling a long list of complaints against the lack of safety regulations. Unfortunately, he was found out by some government agents who, the family believed, started a fire in his office to destroy all of his work. It was the same day he disappeared. From what I gathered and from what he had said to me, they had forced him to clean up some deadly toxic spill and told him to keep his mouth shut unless he wanted his family to suffer a similar fate. That explained why he wouldn't tell us anything. But so many things still didn't make sense. None of it mattered in the end, though. He was terminally ill, but his family wanted us to give him every chance to make it out alive. All of us knew that wasn't possible and that it would only prolong his suffering. However, I wasn't prepared for what would happen next. Slowly, the flesh of his arms and legs melted away, exposing his bones, which forced us to amputate. I was assisting the surgeon at the time, and I'll never forget how his bones had become soft, almost like rubber. After that, he was just a torso and a head, but the horror continued to spread. When the decay reached his face, his skin melted over his eyes, blinding him. He almost choked on the fluid from his own disintegrating tongue. His gums receded, causing his teeth to fall out. He could still breathe, but he had to gurgle through the goop just to get a breath. Burns are often considered one of the worst types of damage to witness on the human body, but that level of radiation damage is somehow worse. He was rotting like a corpse, but he was alive, still breathing. I can't imagine the mental anguish he was going through that entire time, trapped in a body that was becoming unrecognizable and slowly deteriorating. At some point, he could no longer see or hear, but he knew he had turned into a grotesque, monstrous thing. That would be the last memory his loved ones would ever have of him. I can only hope he didn't feel any of it, but I'll never know. Finally, after weeks of horror, his family agreed to stop trying to keep him alive. Only then was he able to die at last. Ever since, I've had nightmares about it. I think it was the slow progression of becoming an abomination of existence that messed with me the most. Of all the ways to die, that has got to be the worst. I'm a registered nurse in a small to mid-sized rural emergency department, and I've been doing this job for about 4 years. One of the biggest challenges we faced is the prevalence of drug abuse and mental illness. I live in a middle ground city, not too big, not too small, surrounded by farmlands and tiny towns. Given the size of my city, we deal with a lot of substance abuse cases, primarily meth-induced. This is where I make my public service announcement for the love of God. Do not do meth under any circumstances. It will absolutely destroy your life. One thing people don't realize is that drug use can lead to mental illness. It's often a chicken and egg scenario whether the mental illness came first or if the drugs caused it. One night, one of our local EMS crews was called for a person experiencing drug-induced psychosis. The patient was brought into our psychiatric holding area, escorted by both EMS and local police officers. The moment I saw him, I could tell he was in full psychosis. He was in his mid-40s to mid-50s, unkempt, with gray hair, unshaven, and dressed in tattered, dirty clothes. He looked like the classic portrayal of a crazy homeless man from a movie. He was extremely paranoid and verbally hostile, convinced we were trying to harm him. We tried to de-escalate the situation without restraining him, but it became clear that wouldn't work. I spoke with the doctor, and we agreed to give him a shot of an antipsychotic. I prepared the syringe and headed back to the psych area. When I entered, there were several people already in the room with him, some of our ER staff, hospital security, and at least 3 or 4 police officers. The patient had calmed down slightly since I last saw him, but he still needed the shot to fully relax. As I approached him with the syringe, he grew paranoid again. After calming him down a bit more, I prepared to give him the shot in his right shoulder. I lifted his shirt sleeve, cleaned the injection site, and grabbed the muscle while he spoke with one of the officers. I gave him the customary 1, 2, 3 countdown and stuck the needle into his shoulder. Now, a quick note about my technique: I hold the syringe like a dart when I insert it. After the needle is in, I switch my grip to hold it between my index and middle fingers, like a cigarette, so my thumb is free to push the plunger. Unfortunately, just as I was changing my grip, the patient freaked out. He looked at the syringe in his arm and panicked, pulling away from me. The syringe stayed in his arm as he moved, and then he yanked it out with his left hand and came at me, wielding the needle as a weapon. The officers sprang into action, and one of them shouted, "Needle," their way of warning everyone in the room. The patient's momentum carried him toward me, and though I tried to get out of the way, I felt an impact on my left thigh. The syringe and needle hit the ground, and I saw that the needle was bent. By then, everyone was on top of the patient, working to restrain him as he screamed at the top of his lungs. I quickly grabbed the needle and syringe to get them out of the way. As I processed what had just happened, I began to panic. Had the needle hit me? The thought of what diseases this man might have terrified me. I rushed to the bathroom to check my leg, and to my immense relief, I found no injury. The only thing I can think of is that the needle hit a pack of gum I had in my pocket at the time. If Wrigley ever needs a spokesperson, I'm available. After the situation was under control, a police officer asked if I wanted to press charges against the patient. At first I said no because I felt sorry for him. He was clearly mentally ill and not fully in control of his actions. But as the shift went on, my feelings changed. Why should I let him off the hook for attacking me just because he was high on meth? Why should I endure the anxiety and unease that came from this incident for the rest of my career? I eventually called the officer back and decided to press charges. But 2 years later, nothing has come of it because the patient was deemed not in his right mind. Once again, I urge everyone, please do not do meth. It ruins lives. I'm a relatively new EMT. I've been doing this job for a little over a year. One of my most memorable calls so far was for a man who had died. The call came in as unresponsive male, possible DOA, which means dead on arrival. We arrived to find the scene eerily quiet. The man's wife was standing at the doorway, clearly distraught but not hysterical. She led us into their small bedroom, where the patient lay flat on his back on the bed. The man looked like he'd been dead for a while. His skin was ashen, his mouth gaped open, and there was the unmistakable odor of decay filling the room. I remember it was one of those cases where the scene just didn't feel right from the beginning, and the hairs on my arm stood up almost immediately. I glanced at my partner, and he had the same look on his face, as if we both sensed something was off. We approached the patient to check for signs of life, although it seemed pretty clear that the man had been gone for some time. I went to feel for a pulse while my partner prepared the defibrillator, just in case. As I touched his wrist, the wife asked if we could try to revive him, but my partner gently explained that it was too late. There was no rigor mortis yet, but it felt like he'd been dead for a few hours. As I leaned in to check his airway for any obstructions, I noticed something strange. There was a slight flicker in his chest, like a faint movement beneath the skin. I thought maybe I was imagining it, or it was just a post-mortem muscle spasm, which isn't uncommon. My partner noticed it too, but we both shrugged it off. We followed the usual protocols, confirming the patient's death and calling it in. The wife, still standing at the doorway, seemed to accept the situation calmly, which in itself was unusual. Typically, there's more of an emotional outburst, but she just stood there, staring at the body. As we packed up our gear and prepared to leave, the room became unbearably heavy. I don't know how to describe it, but the atmosphere felt thick, like the air was pressing down on us. As we were about to step out, we heard a loud gasp come from the patient. Startled, we turned around, only to see his chest rise and fall slowly at first, then more rapidly, like he was struggling to breathe. My partner and I froze, unsure of what was happening. It was impossible for him to be alive after the condition he was in. We immediately ran back to the bed, checked for a pulse, and this time we found one. His heart had restarted out of nowhere. We scrambled to get the oxygen mask on him, our hands shaking from the shock and confusion. We started CPR, trying to stabilize him for transport. The wife stood there, completely unfazed, as if she had expected this to happen. We managed to get him onto the stretcher and into the ambulance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As we sped toward the hospital, the patient's condition began to deteriorate again. His pulse grew weaker, and his breathing became more labored. My partner tried everything we could to keep him stable, but it was no use. He flatlined on the way to the ER. Once we arrived at the hospital, the doctors confirmed that he was gone for good this time. They couldn't explain how he had come back to life for those few minutes. The strangest part was when we returned to the house to fill out the necessary paperwork. The wife was nowhere to be found. We later found out that the man had been dead for almost 6 hours before we arrived, and there was no way he should have been able to come back, even temporarily. To this day, I can't explain what happened during that call. It was like something out of a horror movie, and I still get chills thinking about it.